It's butt ugly, yet this camera stayed in production for 11 years. Is it that unattractive? Let's jump into the video to see more about this camera. Okay, so I think the saying goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So let's take a look at this camera. This is the Kodak 35. However, it's the Kodak 35 with a rangefinder. As you can see, it has a 3.5 lens and the Kodamatic shutter. This is, from what I read, this is the first made in the USA 35mm camera, or Kodak's first made in the USA 35mm camera. There are other earlier Kodak models. In fact, there's several of them. One, I believe, was made for the U.S. Army, and but those didn't have a rangefinder. This model is unique in that it has a rangefinder. So, with that in mind, like I said, let's test that beauty is in the eye of the beholder adage. I have a few thoughts about this camera. So, here it is, the Kodak 35. This one actually comes with the box. So what's unique about this camera? Well, here's the camera. First of all, here are some film sheets for it. Here's the instruction manual. So that's a bit different. And here's a book on Kodachrome. That was one of Kodak's greatest color film transparency films. And then here's a small guide. This is an exposure guide. These were actually included in the Kodak, I don't know if it was a 35mm guide or the Kodak photographer's guide. I'll cover those at some point. Very interesting thing. So let's just put the box aside for a second and we'll talk about this camera. These cameras, I believe, production began in the late 1930s and continued well into the 40s. So, the camera itself has had a long production life. As you can see in the reflection, this is a coated lens, which would indicate that it was made after World War II. And in fact, using the serial number of the lens, I was able to date this to roughly 1949. My opinion about this camera is that it's one of the homeliest cameras ever made. I don't really mean to dump on Kodak, but that's how I feel about it. It just is. By I think probably by 1950 or so, this camera model had pretty much run its course, and it was replaced by this camera model, which is the Signet. This is, I think, one of Kodak's more handsome cameras, and it certainly stands in stark contrast to the Kodak 35 RF. Both are rangefinder models. This is a much smaller, more svelte model. Easier to operate too. And once again, I'll talk about this camera some other day. So let's get back to the Kodak 35. Well, let's look at its weight. So let's get out the scale, of course. And so the Kodak 35 comes in at 1 pound 8 ounces. This camera is, like I said, I think it's sort of homely. I don't know, and I don't think it's homely in a charming way. I just think it's homely. There are just weird things going on with it. There's this whole protrusion here that, I don't know, I guess it helps to protect the mechanism for the rangefinder. Certainly, I think there should have been a better way. I'm not sure what the slot is here. The wheel. This is the focusing wheel. You could actually turn the lens, but it's not as easy as just simply turning this wheel. To focus, you really just use your index finger, and you can see how it rotates the lens in its mount. This would make it a front self-focusing camera. And this uses the Kodak Anastigmat. No, I'm sorry, the Kodak Anistat. I don't know how many elements that is. If I find out, I'll put it on this side here. I'll drop in the information. This lens focuses down to just under 4 feet. I wouldn't say it was 3 feet. It's probably somewhere 3.5 feet, and that's fairly common. So it's not going to be your first choice for doing any close-up work. However, it's perfect for portraits and things like this. I can't tell you about the performance of this lens because I haven't used it. Let's go over the top deck. This is your film advance. As you can see, it says wind. You would turn this knob in the direction of the arrow. This is just a film minder to let you know what kind of film you have loaded, and because there's no meter, obviously there's no connection other than serving to remind you what type of film you have. This is not a shutter release. This actually is a film. Let me see. I'm going to guess, yes, that's for rewinding the film. So it's not press and release. You would have to press and then wind your film. Press and hold while you rewind your film. And that's fairly common. No surprise there. This might be to adjust the rangefinder. I'm not positive. I have serviced the camera, but I'm not 100% on what the purpose of the screw on top is for. As you can see, there are two windows. This is the window for focusing, and if you think that's small, you're right. It is. It is very tiny. So let's see just how tiny that is. That is roughly, well, is that 1/8 of an inch? Let's see, let's come in at 1. So that is yes, that's 1/8 of an inch. And the height is maybe a 1/16. Because you have two separate windows, you would use this to focus your photo, or focus on your subject, whatever it happened to be, and then you would use this to compose your photo. The more effective systems have these side by side. However, there are cameras in which they are very separate and distinct. So at least you won't confuse the two. This uses actually this has two images stacked on top of each other, and then you align the two. To remove the back, you have this small rotating, you can't really call it a switch, but it's a rotating, I'll have to think of the word. You would turn this in the direction where it says open. Here, this is where it's closed. So you would turn this in the direction of open, and then the back slides off. Also, here's your tripod screw. It's always nicer when the tripod post or tripod screw, that's not really even a screw, is it? It's always nice when the tripod, when you can connect, when the tripod post, and well, let's just call it a post, is centered above the lens. However, as you can see, you have your back lock here, so that's not possible. The back simply slides off, much like many German cameras did. On the back, we have a nice little advertisement, load with Kodak 135 films. Remember, 35mm film when it was introduced was called 135, but became really just popularly known as 35mm film. Yes, this was serviced by a repair company in New York. I don't know the year. That would have been fun to know. Although it does have the person's initials and it does have a service number on it. This is the pressure plate. This one is actually fairly tightly sprung. Sometimes these pressure plates are more lightly sprung. The purpose of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat across the film plane. So when you take your photo, your film is as flat as possible. Of course, if the film were to bow or otherwise lift at one of the corners, it wouldn't be in focus. You would get some blurry image. All this, of course, is dependent upon the lens taking as sharp as image as possible. One thing that I found with Kodak cameras, at least the Kodak 35 in this camera, is this thing is so tightly sprung. You would think that it would almost damage the film as it goes past, as you advance it. See, it takes considerable effort, there we go, to advance the film. However, in practice, I've never actually torn film, although I have read where people said that they have. All right, what are your shutter, here's your shutter controls on the front. Your shutter speeds are on top, and as you can see, you only have you have speeds running from 1/200th of a second down to 1/10 in B and T. Your aperture selector is at the bottom. This is fairly common. This is a flash synchronization post. This doesn't really have an accessory shoe, so if you were to use a flash, you would have to mount this somehow on a bracket with the flash separate. Remember, in that day, there were no electronic flashes. This camera was made in, what did I say, 1949? Although its production began in 1938. And so we all know, certainly, that there were no electronic flashes in 1938, so it was all bulb flash. If you've never seen a bulb flash go off, it's quite a treat. Maybe from behind the camera, not as much fun if you're the one whose photo is being taken. This is your shutter release. Very tiny. All right, so as a quick reminder, this is a very stiff dial. It almost requires two hands to select your shutter speed. There will be no accidental movement of your shutter speed selection. I think, there definitely are fans of this camera. I'm not really one of them, as you can tell. The camera is sort of clunky to use. The fact that you have to focus using, your index finger, and it's a very stiff film advance. And, your front-mounted shutter release is fine, but you really have to reach for it. So if you have shorter fingers, or if you have smaller hands, you are probably going to have a bit of trouble finding this shutter release. So there we have it, the Kodak 35 rangefinder model, made from 1938 to 1949. I mean, that's quite a run. I'm not entirely sure of how many were produced during that run, but enough to keep it alive for, 11 years? At least, maybe 12 years. So, I guess it certainly had its fans, and there are plenty of these available on the used market. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and please come back for more.